The United States is a hegemonic global power, holding economic, political, military, and cultural influence across the planet. It is a country that has been at the forefront of pushing the political ideology of democracy. For decades, it has stood ahead or nearly ahead of almost all other countries in terms of population, geographic size and location on two oceans, economic resources, and military potential. The country's red, white, and blue symbolizes hardiness, valor, purity, innocence, vigilance, perseverance, and justice. However, most importantly, they are colors on a flag that has internationally represented the promises of freedom. These colors hold significance as they tell the tale of U.S. history. It goes to echo sentiments that history is told from the side of the victor. However, it is more strategic than simply the stories of the victors. History is the picture painted by a palette of digestible colors and elements. The victors are merely the artist at the easel. The mirage of history that the world is presented with is limited in scope, failing to provide color at the discretion of the victor. The red, white, and blue are simply symbolic of all that the United States wants to be seen as. But there are a myriad other shades of which discredit the image painted as triumphant and free. These are the shades of torture. From its shadowy beginning, United States history has been told as a narrative highly selective in color, from the colonial settlement of the 1600s and the American Revolution to the creation of a new nation with the signing of the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution, all the way up till the Civil War and Reconstruction, the Industrial Revolution, the Progressive Era, the Great Depression, and WWII, up till present day after the war. America has paved the way for the construction of a story of triumph and opportunity, the land of the free and home of the brave, as so eloquently sung in the national anthem. However, what is not so readily pictured within such a story are the stories of all too many regarded as other within the country. The stories of slavery and suffering, the two S's. Stories of torture and violence are overshown and disregarded in America's painting of freedom. Torture should be conceptualized as the act of causing great physical or mental pain to persuade someone to do something, or to give information, or to be cruel to a person or animal. Cambridge Dictionary. With its general purpose of subordination and indoctrination, torture is a multifaceted concept that can take various forms. To answer the question, what picture is the U.S. painting in light of its torturous and violent acts? Using the two S's pegged to the perception of modern-day democracy in conversation with a famous excerpt from Angela Davis's Abolition Democracy, this documentary will shine a light on the United States' shades of torture. First, this documentary will cover one of the most referenced yet least understood shades of torture: slavery. The United States is built upon the backs of the torturous conditions of slavery. However, despite hundreds of years of labor, their work, pain, and suffering go unbeknownst. Something that was readily on display during the time that Malcolm X was at Columbia University. This is highlighted in the question, quote, "You said that white men are responsible for the condition that black people are in, and then you said that they should give the black people land. How do you reconcile these two?" Unquote. A question that portrays the lack of care and knowledge on the contributions of black people to America, not to mention disregard for the plights faced by such enslaved. All of this is understood through Malcolm X's response, which immediately rebuttals the question, stating the ease to which such can reconcile, as he mentions, quote, "When you consider that our people were slaves in this country for over 310 years, this was the contribution of free labor, slave labor." Unquote. He opens before expounding upon America as a product of unpaid, forced labor, which permitted it to excel to such heights of wealth. Malcolm ascertains that, quote, "This is the contribution that the Negro made to the American economic, political, and social system," unquote. The lack of appreciation and education of the Black contribution to the United States demonstrates the hearkening reality of the state's narrative, a twisted report that paints the picture, removing those revered as others. In the words of Angela Davis, we might also reflect on the unrepresentability of slavery and its myriad acts of violence. And unrepresentability is showcased when, instead of inquiring about the victim's state, questions are asked to protect the image of the victor, the one perpetuating harm. Angela Davis mentions that for too long, such questions have been asked and actions have been taken, questions that limit the fundamental understanding of such atrocities. Violence is met with questions of how is this possible? How can this happen? And assertions of this is not supposed to happen. Merely questions and phrases that shield tainting to the hypocrisies of American democracy. For this reason, both Malcolm X and Angela Davis would agree that in the American portrait, there wanes a color for accountability. Second, elements are often rejected, fragmented, or excluded under the constructed narrative of history. An instance of this erasure can be traced to the U.S. violation of the laws of the military conquest of the Philippine Islands in 1900. This explicitly touches on the omitted shades of terror within the portrait of U.S. history, including a tactic known as the water cure. Frank Schumacher's Mark Severities discusses the terrors of torture mechanisms, purposed as interrogation techniques. The torture of prisoners and suspected guerrillas was propelled by seated racism and the escalatory nature of war. However, following symbolic charges of such atrocities, the nation observed as the debate of torture and violence was brought to a halt, with public outrage meeting containment with patriotic nationalism, emotional fatigue, and the nation's exceptional moral superiority. This is how the country resumed, mindful of its image and ideals of democracy, yet refusing to treat horrid testaments with attention and further conversation. The following is a testimony from a soldier, Ample, Private A.F. Miller from the 32nd Volunteer Infantry Regiment, describing the water cure's brutal technique. Quote, "Now, this is the way we give them the water cure. Lay them on their backs, a man standing on each hand and each foot. Then put a round stick in the mouth and pour a pail of water in the mouth and nose. And if they don't give up, pour in another pail. They swell up like toads. I'll tell you it's a torture." And quote, these are the images removed from American history. They are images and colors that faced erasure due to their impact on the American painting red, white, and blue. In Abolition Democracy, Angela Davis observes this in the following quote as she alludes to how the United States meets images of torture and violence. Quote, "The images depicting torture at Abu Ghraib were released into an environment so charged with assumptions about the hegemony of U.S. democracy that the images themselves were overwhelmingly understood in the context of the need to explain them in relation to democracy." Unquote. This holds especially in the case of the torture carried out in the Philippines. Though far from home, the premise remains the same. People are so inclined to push the American narrative and paint the American picture using American colors that they are often disillusioned with American torture and violence, most of which is regarded as unimaginable, but is it genuinely unimaginable or erased? Finally, observing the United States treatment of perpetuated instances of torture and violence, such as that of slavery and suffering, it is evident that the country is at odds with its image of democracy and righteousness. Dr. Martin Luther King's Beyond Vietnam closely examines this as it interrogates the United States' international image in light of its violent engagements. In his speech, Dr. King extends his compassion to those in the peninsula of Vietnam, a people he sympathizes with due to the ironic wrongs which the United States have brought upon them. He mentions such as segues into the background of the U.S.-Vietnam relationship, extending to America's support of Vietnamese colonizers. Quote, "The only change came from America as we increased our troop commitments to support governments that were singularly corrupt, inept, and without popular support. All the while, The people read our leaflets and received the regular promises of peace, democracy, and land reform. Now they languish under our bombs and consider us, not their fellow Vietnamese, the real enemy." Unquote. While it is essential to understand the situation of perpetuated violence in the name of democracy, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would urge the spread of love and revolution to counter the remarks of the great Buddhist leaders of Vietnam perpetuated by U.S. militant action. The image of America will never again be the image of revolution, freedom, and democracy, but the image of violence and militarism. This sentiment ties to that of Angela Davis as much like Dr. King. She explicitly inquires about the imagery perpetuated by the state, especially imagery that directly contradicts assumptions of democracy. However, she outlines slavery and imprisonment, and the unpopular United States actions against the Vietnamese fall under this category of torture and violence, as much like the instance outlined of the prisoners. Quote, "The concern with rescuing U.S. democracy pushed the suffering of the prisoners into the background," unquote, prevails, and instead of digesting the pain inflicted upon the Vietnamese population, a concern of American imagery remains at the forefront of conversation. As the Vietnamese trauma is erased from the picture, the situation is justified in the eyes of the victors, the red, white, and blue, yet torn in the eyes of the victims the undepicted shades of torture. Though Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. does play into the narrative of the American image, as Vietnamese trauma maintains a place within the background of the portrait. Both he and Angela Davis speak to the questionability of the American imagery of democracy. Additionally, both authors are keen to note its selective narrative nature. In conclusion, this documentary has explored the dark crevices of United States history and examined the portrait at hand. The American narrative has for years been told on a palette that includes some, with the exclusion of others. It is a palette that boasts principles of democracy, yet fails to highlight the complete picture. This documentary uses history to demonstrate three strategic elements of the American narrative. The American narrative lacks accountability, perpetuates the erasure of history, and keeps the ideology of democracy at its forefront. So the next time you catch yourself painting history when thinking of the patriotic red, white, and blue, remember to include the shades of torture,